All right, well, it is 3 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and introduce you two and then turn my video off here. But welcome everyone to our third installment of the Inclusive Pedagogy Professional Development webinar series that we are holding right now. Tiffany and Donna are going to lead us through another wonderful session today on how to embed inclusion in our current coursework. So with that, they've already left a slide up here for you all to start working on if you would like, and I will turn it over to both of them. Thank you all.
Hi, and it's great to be back with the group. We are really having a fun time working on this each week, and it's really exciting. I'll just start by saying I'm going to kind of lead off and focus on the topic that we proposed for today, and focusing on adding things on identity inclusion to courses that we're working on, maybe just small pieces here and there. And then Tiffany, I'll yield it back over to Tiffany, and she's going to lead on really addressing things that you identified in last week's survey that you would like to have more information on, you have more questions. And so we've really split our topics, our time about in half, and we hope to leave a good amount of time for conversation afterwards of more questions, and because we think that has worked well each week. So that's kind of how we're going to lay this out. So the first part is pretty constructed, and then the part Tiffany is going to work on has a lot of great material in it, and it kind of covers a broad area of things. And then we've had some ideas that perhaps, sorry, my colleague who shares my workspace turned down his volume, or his, yeah, so. Anywho, all right, so that's how we're going to then look at some ideas we've kind of come up with, or perhaps continuing this conversation, because it seems based on the survey feedback that this is an ongoing conversation. People seem to have an interest in continuing to do the work. So a couple ideas there. Without further ado, let's take a look at some things. And some of this is a little bit of a revisit from last week, but maybe bringing some of that into what we want to do on a more specific level. So as I've thought about what I hope to do, and Kelly's on the call today, our new faculty member, yay, and we're going to be working hard to do more of this in our classes. So while I share with you, these are all ideas I have, but because we've been short a faculty member, I have not had time to add all this to our courses, because I've been really focused on the Pathways general education course I've been teaching, and really working hard on making sure that content's great. So now that we're up to 3 faculty, I think we're gonna have a chance to do more ourselves. So don't think I've got this all under control and like we're all doing this 100% at Tech. I think we're gonna make a lot of progress here in the next month. But one thing that I think is really important, and I kind of started this with history, okay? So our land grants, we all learned about the history of the land grant. Basically, there was a moral act. But land grants, we spent a little time just identifying where this land came from and talked about that last week. But how are we going to teach that to our students? It's good for us to know as faculty members, but one thing I think is really important is to have a piece of this in whatever we call our introduction to agricultural education, ag, communications, and leadership, are over an extension, all those classes we teach across the country, just giving you an overview of, everything ag ed. And so I think it's really important to share this piece here. As I see it, I think it's important to have students look at the map. And I didn't include the map, I ditched it. I think I did it later. But looking at the map I shared last week, it's in a later slide, and helping students understand what tribal communities existed and still exist today in your state, and taking time to learn that, learn the names of the tribal communities, which ones are federally and state recognized, and then talking about then how do we work as educators, broadly speaking, to reach those communities. And one thing I'm really focused on right now is supporting our students who want to be extension educators, who are then going to be based in counties that may have populations as part of our tribal communities, our reservations or whatever their status is, how are we going to incorporate that so that we can have conversations with students to understand who might be in their communities in the counties where they work. So that's a space I think we're spend some time on, and using the map that and looking at what's who is in our communities, then trying to spend some time looking at those particular cultures of those indigenous communities, recognizing that different indigenous communities have different cultural histories and practices, and not all indigenous communities are the same. They have some commonality, but they're all unique. What is fortunate at this point in history is that many of them have websites, like the Monacan tribe is the tribe that's recognized. This is the land that Virginia Tech sits on, and the Monacan tribe has a wonderful website with videos and history and a collection of their new press releases and things about their different projects. So they're really accessible and easy. It's easy to incorporate information about their community in my classes because it's all right there. All very fortunate that tribal leaders have been working with our universities, and so we know them, we've had a chance to meet them, we've done some interactive activities with the community, and we're continuing to do some more outreach in that particular community, so it makes it a little easier. But I found that many of the tribal communities in our state, regardless of their federal state status, have an online presence, so you can start there. And encourage students to just learn about what I find my students, when I incorporate it into my one class, is I ask them to find the tribal communities near where they live. And I've had students say, whoa, it's just down the road, like through my house. The idea that there was a tribal community in the area, it really is overlooked. Conversations, helping students understand, tribal communities exist, and that they can really learn a lot from just accessing some of this online information. So if you're trying to figure out, I'm just stopping my video because I don't have great internet this afternoon, but I think that's a really great place to start, and there's lots of resources. And this is something that if somebody wants to really work on this, I'd be happy to spend a little more time, or more time, not even just a little, figuring out how we might be teaching this. I think we really need to spend a little more time on slavery and impact of slavery on agriculture specifically. And a great resource for this, I think we've listed it other places, but the 1619 project that was published by the New York Times last year, commemorating the 400 years of, sadly, the slavery in the US. This is a phenomenal project. Not only is it an extensive document, you do have to pay to download that, but there's a lot of other video and really phenomenal resources around this project that would really, again, be really easy to bring to class and have students reading outside or watching outside of class to help understand more of the extensive impact of slavery on agriculture, and really spending more time on the economic impact of slavery and what it did not only for agriculture, but then the economic development of our entire country. Because I think right now, as we talk about, we don't even hardly talk about slavery in our history of agriculture focus. We leave that sort of to the history department. And I think it's really important that we spend a little more time with helping our students understand that really the social, political, economic, all the impacts, the moral, ethical situation we've put ourselves in because of this. So that's something I think we can put into particularly teaching our future teachers and extension educators, particularly in states where you have 2 land grants, and you would like to think you're going to be collaborating with colleagues at the other land grant, the 1890 perhaps in your state. Think spending a little more time understanding real slavery issues and the story of slavery in your state can put you in a better situation, not classroom, but working universities. There's also, if you Google slave owners in such and such a state or even such and such a county, again, my students are assigned to go look who were the slave owners in your county. There are plenty here in Virginia, and literally I'm sitting in New York State, and there were slaves in New York State as well. So if you're a New England or a northern state, don't think that this doesn't exist in your history. The county I grew up in is called Schoharie County, and there were slave owners in the southern part of our county. So technically not in the part of county that my family grew up in and was located, but they were very close to home. So this is not something far, far away if you're a northern state. State capitals typically had slaves, so you need to think about it as well. Boston had an extensive slave population, and Albany is the same way. New York City is huge. So all of your major cities with heavy mercantile presence had a lot of slaves. So this is not something you just talk about as a slave state or as a southern state topic. And I'm happy to chat a little bit more about that if people are interested. So I will emphasize, so with this, I didn't put a thing on here but it's really easy to, is really being able to find those slave owners in your state and counties. This is something Tiffany brought to the conversation last week when we started brainstorming what we were going to talk about today, and the discrimination and issues around access to capital, access to programs. The USDA, this is something else you can Google, and you can find about the Pigford cases where the USDA did have a settlement with black farmers, although it did not go well and is not something we should be pleased with. There really wasn't the funding put to these cases and the settlements to support the black farmers that brought the cases against the federal government. So and those cases are based on, again, access to programs, access to any of the USDA programs and funding. If you think about in your local county, what opportunity there are for farmers for credit and for all sorts of different educational experiences, they were blocked from most black farmers. So there's a huge issue there. So as we think about teaching our students in our classes, generally this is still, again, an ag, basically an intro class for our department. I think it's important to help students understand systemically and systematically how broad-reaching discrimination and racism has been in agriculture. And it didn't end with the end of slavery. And depending on, especially if you want to think about how that, it's kind of even not clear when the ending was, because there were people that were able to retain slaves beyond what we call our technical end. And then the issues, if you want to go into this farther, how do the Jim laws and issues of farm access, land access after the Civil War, what happened with that? And I think that's important to spend a little time on in thinking about who had the equity and access to land to farm. So I'm going to shift a little bit, and two of these pictures were images you saw last week. And this is one thing I really want to work on myself. I'm going to work on how I'm helping my pre-service teachers think about teaching that history of agriculture that we teach in the introduction to ag in the secondary level. And that I'm really going to emphasize, helping our secondary students learn what tribal communities are in their state, in their part of the state, and in their town. And then I introduced the In the Shadow of Slavery text last week. This text I think I'm going to have our students reading this and helping them learn the history of the African Americans who came to the US, and thinking about, and how are we going to teach all the skills and talent that Africans brought to the United States. They were skilled livestock managers and herdsmen. They were very skilled and had very advanced genetic development of plants and developing crops. And so as people traveled from West Africa to the United States to then be slaves on these plantations, they didn't come here as like a blank slate that then the plantation owners taught them. They brought tremendous talent here, which then contributed extensively to the success of plantations because they brought their herding practices. They brought plants with them, hiding the seeds in their clothing and their hair. And if you read this book, you'll learn there's more than 20 of our predominant crops that we really enjoy and as part of our food system that are from West Africa. But you also need to, it'll be interesting if you choose to read this, to learn about how future slaves were selected from different areas of Africa because they were talented herds people. So they were stolen from their communities and kidnapped and brought here to be slaves because they were able to do the skills that were needed on the plantations. And then certainly we don't spend enough time on understanding the migrant workers and Latino, Latina, Latinx, how they choose Hispanic, how they choose to identify themselves, how that community of people really are key to the success for ag production, both on the planting side and the harvesting side of crop production. And what does that mean for our industry, and how are farm workers treated and positioned and understood, with particularly our young people, and how they think about all the people that are working across the industry. So those are things I'm going to be working on. I'm on sabbatic this fall, but in the spring, I hope to really be focusing on this piece. And again, I'd love to talk to others about it because right now it's a lot of stuff going on in my head. And then we talked a little bit about gender last week, and you saw the gender unicorn as a thing I mentioned. Regardless of your personal perspective on gender, we need to be inclusive of all students in our programs. And to be honest with you, 4-H is doing a far better job of this, in my personal opinion, than ag education at the secondary level and how we're supporting our secondary teachers. And this is a very real issue, and not one that I think we can avoid at the university level, because Tiffany and I and Hannah, as we work with our students and then our teachers, we are having people communicate back to us, seeking our advice on what to do with field trips, overnight field trips, overnight experiences. National FFA is already working on this. They have not resolved the Washington Leadership Conference issue with too many. They have currently still 4 students per room for lodging. They know that's a problem. They of course canceled this summer, but as they move forward with the programming for next year, that's still an issue, and they need to figure out how financially to make it accessible to students without being excessively costly, but still giving students space they need to respect their gender identity. That's a very real thing. And it's something we are talking about in our classes, because our teachers are working with students who are identify across the spectrum of identity and expression. And so it's really important that we give them the foundational skills so that they are not caught off guard in their early years of teaching when they have to address this issue, and they have students they want to have participating in not only their classroom, but their leadership experiences. And you have to figure this out. My first answer to them is you need to talk with your administrator to determine your school policy before you move forward with any policy for your FFA activities. That's the first message. Again, happy to spend a little more time on this later, depending on where you all are at with what you're interested in. And with that, that's my part of the program. Again, I'll circle back to this after I read a little bit more in the comments, but then I'd like to have Tiffany come back in and participate and facilitate this part.
Cool. Thank you. Let's see, I should switch over to my poor screen because I want to show some stuff on the internet. So as Donna shared, I'm going to talk through mostly a lot of the feedback that we've got the last 2 weeks. So number one, we really appreciate the constructive feedback. We know that everybody has more questions, and part of growing and maturing maybe is you wake up and you know even less than you did the day before. I know that that's how I feel most of the time. So a lot of folks asked about, how do you deal with students? How do you work through, right, some issues with students, confrontations? And the way I interpreted a lot of these comments was you really asking about conflict resolution and conflict management. When you discuss things of this nature, some people will definitely have feelings, right? They will spark conversation or debate in your classes or among your group of graduate students or your FFA officers, you know, depending on who's in front of you or with you in that moment. And so a couple years ago, I was really fortunate to do conflict management resolution training through the university. I will show you the gentleman's website here when I switch over to some of the other ADA things. But what he was really great about was really trying to help us as participants figure out how not to let it get, I don't want to say out of hand, but escalating in a negative way. And so what this gentleman had shared was all these phrases. These are also the phrases that are on my door of my office. Someday when everybody goes back to their office on a regular basis, you can walk by it and see underneath the hokey bird are these phrases in particular. And so a lot of times I also employ these, not because I lack for the ability to think through it myself, but because someone else has already done it for me. And the number one thing I do usually ask students is, can you tell me more about that? Or can you share with me why you feel that way? And I know a lot of us on here are human subjects researchers, and we don't always talk to folks who would quote unquote agree with our worldview, but we want their feedback, we want their data, and they have consented. And so one of the number one questions I ask all the time, my undergrad research assistants tell me this because they're the ones that transcribe most of the audio that I collect, is I'll say, why do you feel that way, right? Why did that elicit that response from you? What was familiar about that, or what was unfamiliar? And then sometimes at the end, as we know from last week and the year before, or the week before, not the year before, our students, our peers, our colleagues, pick a population, we just want to know that we feel like we belong with them. And so sometimes we just want to be heard. I cannot resolve some things in life, right, automatically, but I can look at someone and say, I empathize with you. You know, I hear you and I see you. But when you're working with folks who it does become a debate or there's clearly disagreement about what's happening, these are some prompts that you can certainly ask to help you kind of work through with that student or person what they're kind of thinking through. What does their train of thought lead them to believe? We had a question last week, I think, about, well, a lot of my students and I, we grew up in places with no underrepresented populations. And so that's why my students will say, I don't have a problem, you know, with race. There was no Black people, there was no Hispanics, there were no Asians where I grew up. And then so, you know, when we talk to our students or our colleagues, we surely know that some of us grew up in very rural areas and some of us still live in very rural areas, but we also grew up with ideas about populations that were different than us. We watched movies of populations that were different than us. So even if we didn't physically have them, we were being impressioned upon from them. And so there's another way that if your students or your colleagues or, you know, people in your life are saying and deflecting off of it, you know, we saw media, even in rural upstate New York, where we just had 3 channels, like so many of you, we saw different things. So the bottom line is this takes time. I don't anticipate that anybody on this call is, you know, gonna get into a knockdown, drag out. I'm 99% sure of that, but it does take time to feel comfortable, to feel competent. And sometimes it does come down to feeling a little bit bold or brave about it. Even as somebody who grew up in white society as a not white person, it took me a long time to stand up for myself when people would say things or slight me. And now I need to work on that with my students. because now I advocate for them. And so when we're working with our students, our peers, pick your group, during the first week, one of the last slides said, you know, are we trying to change their mind, or are we trying to give that person or people a path to investigate? And I think there's a big difference there. We all see the news. We all see the funny memes on Facebook or Twitter or whatever about how you can't change anyone's mind, or an argument was never solved on Facebook. So as we think about that with our teaching and with our formal and informal instruction, are we trying to change their mind, or are we giving them a path to go down to investigate? And that's a decision that's up to you. This is not me saying this is what you should be doing. It's saying what's your motivation for engaging with that as well. Again, some more conflict resolution. Use their words, not yours. If you hear them say something very concrete, I felt, or I'm super mad right now. Well, why are you super mad, right? You may never use that term personally, but they hear you when you hear them. Start where they are right then and there, not where you're trying to get them to be, right? I could have aspirations of becoming, you know, a professional athlete or something. If you see me, it's never going to happen, right? But start with where they are right now, not at the pros, if you will. Be genuinely curious and open to what they're saying. It can't be a one over or a gloss over, even if it's something that you vehemently disagree with. I had a person participate in my dissertation study years and years ago who said some really outlandish things, but instead of having that response that I wanted to, I kept reminding myself, this is research. So I need to ask this person why, or please tell me more, right? Notice what they're saying, what they're not. Relate to them, right? You have relationships with your students, your peers, your colleagues. I would say almost all of them are worth nurturing and putting time into, if not all of them. And again, notice how you feel, which it sounds a little weird, but when I'm in the middle of talking to somebody about race or issues of equity, or how I don't want to do any more free labor, I know how I feel about it. And I'm willing to share that now with my peers and colleagues. I had to do it last weekend. You get one question with me. If you ask a second one, I charge $100 an hour. That was my response to this person in my life. They just kept pushing, but I kept pushing back. I was done with the free labor. I take responsibility for my part in any of these conflicts and misunderstandings. Apologies and doing them well take a little practice. But when I'm wrong, I'm very happy to say, I am sorry, right? And that's a great place to start. Stick with it. It's a process. These are relationships worth fostering, as we all know. It's not just a quick solution. It's not just a one-off and you're going to be done with it. These take time. And unfortunately, we live in the McDonald's society. We want it in 90 seconds or less, or now we just get it delivered to our door. Not always possible in some of these issues that you and your students or people in your life will undertake with. So we've talked, people also asked about more recommendations for readings, audio, media. Our lists are by no means comprehensive, just to be very clear. It would take 2 lifetimes to probably consume all the media that exists of experts and other folks on these topics. I do a lot of driving. As I shared last week, I will put stuff on my Voice Aloud app, and thank heavens that no one's usually in the car with me, or else they'd get stuck listening to my manuscript list as well. But if you do a lot of driving, or you put the podcast on because you're just around the house or doing whatever you do, there's 4 that are a good place to start. Seeing White's been very popular. And then the SLAN talks about Indigenous communities. We all might have seen the Supreme Court decision last week or the week before about Oklahoma. So there are current events that you can work with your students on attaching these things to. So it's not just all history. Some of it's very current. This is a really ugly slide. My advance apologies, and I appreciate your patience. I didn't take the time to put all the book covers and all that jazz on here. But again, people were asking for more. So this recording will be available. You can skip right ahead to this. You can grab a screenshot right now. You can email me and I'll just send I'll copy and paste this and put it in the body of the email, however it works. Again, I have not read everything. I read a bunch, but I know that there's a bunch 3 times this size that I have not read. There's also books sitting right here at my house right now that didn't make the list, not because they're not good, but because I was trying to prioritize things that I thought would be useful for the folks, my audience on the phone. You know, decolonizing methods. I teach methods classes. I know a lot of you do too, right? Teaching about community. How do we be more inclusive, right? So you can work through those at your own pace. Most of our libraries have those. If your library is you know, checking books out and things, and so on and so forth. So we can come back and visit those. So I know a lot of us watched the Manners webinar yesterday. I did too. And I really enjoyed this, this quote that one of the panelists shared. People won't do what you expect, they do what you inspect. And you can think through that however you like. But when I was thinking about getting ready for class, because we are all getting ready for class, I don't care if you're a secondary teacher, a 2-year, a 4-year, right? All of us are getting ready. Some of our schools are releasing plans. Some of our schools, like our county down here, changed their plan last night in a very long Board of Education meeting. It went 12 hours, I think, or 7 or 8 at least, and they had a break, very long. So a lot of us will be teaching online this fall, at least part of it, if not all of it. So the tips and tools today are really geared towards online instruction. It doesn't mean some of these are not applicable someday when we're all back face to face. So that's how I thought through this today. Our learning management systems, I know they are ubiquitous among public education, pre-K-12 and post-12 and up. So these become very essential. A lot of folks are using Google Classroom, Canvas, Moodle, name it, I'm sure it's on the list. The big thing that I've learned over 5 years of doing this is if I don't have all that content at least available before class, I always have students who end up struggling. Sometimes they need to have it sent out to get it put in Braille, or they need to make sure, excuse me, all the audio is more exact than maybe my closed captioning service is. So if you can, try as hard as you can. I know it's not always possible to get at least the mandatory, right, content up and available before the class begins. In my online classrooms, I usually say, this is what I absolutely want you to do this week, or read or consume or watch, and here's extras. The extras maybe were those last minute additions that I forgot about, saw, you know, 2 days earlier and thought, ooh, that's a really great resource, etc. But if you can, try and avoid those last minute changes on the mandatory, if you will, or the required things. I've gotten feedback for years now that if I do screencasts or audio that go longer than 5 to 7 minutes, they get tuned out to me immediately. They've even said to me, you can break a whole bunch up into 5 minutes, but when you just string them all in one long video, it gets to be a little bit too much to watch. And sure enough, I had to go back and watch myself, and I realized how long it was to listen to me for 6 minutes. So I appreciate your patience. The biggest thing I've learned besides consistency is you got to simplify and slow down what you're teaching, because your students will not, quote unquote, be in front of you all the time in the same way. It's hard. On the right side, it may be small for you. Those are the modules for my upcoming qualitative inquiry and community class that I'm going to start teaching this fall. Not a lot of modules there, and that is done on purpose. I pulled those today. I pulled the screenshot at lunchtime today. I've been working on the class all summer. So you're going to have to think about how to simplify. What do you want your students to understand when they leave that semester, that class, that marking period or quarter? Again, however your university or education system, you know, delivers that. Grades mean a whole lot less in online instruction, I've found. I teach methods, so again, not necessarily the same classes as all of you. Feedback, giving feedback, and giving good quality feedback, not this is good, this is bad, right? Like giving substantive feedback becomes super important to the students. The grade is the grade. They still want to earn a good grade, but they really need that feedback, because we are missing that concentrated, right individually in front of us time. Screens are great, but we all know Zoom has its own advantages and disadvantages too. So the summative assessments that I've started working towards with all of my students, no matter what class I teach, is focusing on the creation of something, not the memorization, because they have all the resources they need. Plus they also have the internet, their university or school libraries. They have all these resources at their disposal. Make sure you communicate clearly when you will communicate, set those boundaries. I know Donna has shared her cell phone with my students. I usually do it too. None of them disrespect it. But I also say, if you want to meet in the chat in Canvas, which is our LMS, or you want to meet on Zoom, you tell me, right? I will adapt to what works for you, because not everybody has connection as good as you and I might. Mine's actually not that great. Some of your students will have siblings home this fall who are also competing for internet time. One of my students who works for me, they had a sign-up sheet at their house. He had 3 siblings and both of his parents all of a sudden were home. They had a sign-up sheet as to who got the video bandwidth at what times of the day. So some of this will just be adapting because it's never been like this before. Student mode. I was famous, not so famous, for never hitting publish on my modules. And the students would say, I can't see it, I can't find it. And I would get frustrated, but then I'd say, oh, you were right. We are allowed at this university to go into student view, so I can see the class as my students would. I rely on this probably more than I should, but I want to test those things before. I want to make sure that anybody and everybody in the class can see that. I have even had people in my family click on links before and say, what do you see on your screen, right? If an outsider who's totally outside of my university bubble, what do they see? They are usually good participants and play along. Order those closed captions if you can this summer in the content that you already know you're gonna teach. Use, model, recommend any of the tools that you use so your students can see them work, that it's a doable feat. They have a lot of faith in you. They really look up to you. So as long as you can do it, it will tell them, I can probably do this too. And because our kids and our students are super smart, it's okay to also ask them what they use. One of the things I'm gonna show you in a second, a grad student whose committee I'm on, he shared it with me. I had no idea it existed. I'll just be honest. He shared it. I'm like, ooh, let me see that. So they see a lot of media. It may just not be the stuff you wanted them to look at. So it's also okay to ask them, what the heck are you using this week? And they'll help you out. It sounds really redundant, but make sure folks can hear you. If you want a synchronous section or a synchronous class once a week, or however you all are gonna manage this, it's really important to also make sure it's accessible to everybody. Let students know if it's going to be recorded, because students will then make adjustments. Maybe they don't sit there and take notes as rigorously. They can go back to the recording. Maybe they are that, like my student's family who had to sign up for video time on the internet and they have some lags. They're not as worried if it skips or they have to dump off and then call back on, right? The recording will be there. Camera placement, same thing. Make sure that it's in the frame, confirm its placement. Most of us are adept now at like Zoom backgrounds and things like that. And then making eye contact. It sounds a little awkward. We all see the little tiny like eye of the camera at the top of our laptops or our external one, but it is important to look into it, even if you know you're gazing into almost nothing. So then the students can see you at least try to make eye contact, and they'll probably reciprocate for you. They do want that connection, even if they can't be right in front of you. All right, I'm gonna close out of this. So as I was thinking through, and our IT person and I were emailing this morning saying, what does Virginia Tech pay for? I'm gonna show you some resources. Knowing who's on the call, I shot for the middle. A lot of our higher education institutions pay for Google accounts or Microsoft Office 365 as 2 solid examples. Others cost extra money. You may have that, you may not. Your university may make you go through an acquisition period for software. Check with it. I don't care what kind of education institution you're at, just check. Because I don't want anyone to come back and say, oh, you told me I could do this. I don't know, as an example, like Texas A&M's purchasing policy. So please just check. So I don't want any of you to get in trouble, basically, as a result of this. All right. So the first thing that we've got is Google Jamboard. Google, Virginia Tech has big accounts for, some of you do as well. Google is, they sell all their own equipment now as well, in case you didn't know that. I didn't know that until this morning. But they have these Jamboards. They're basically smart boards that, you know, are more high tech. But a lot of us on this call or on this Zoom want to give examples, especially our bench science friends, our math instructors, right? They want to do those examples in real time, but they're like, how do I do that if I don't have the right tablet or the right setup? Jamboard is one that is available. And if you are a Google campus or a Google educational institution, should be part of it. If it's not, ask. Maybe they just haven't paid for it yet this year and they just need the request so they can, you know, make the expense or I don't know what the word I want is, but anyway, so they can justify it. There we go. That's the word that I wanted. But Google Jamboard is cool. Even if you're not a big Google fan, you can drag and drop. You can then download these as well. Again, if your students are having connectivity issues, they can then see what you did or what you drew or typed or whatever in class. And then also it just will send it to the cloud as well. So if you have a course website that's through Google Drive, you can ask it to just send it there. After, you know, an hour, you can set the timeline and parameters on that. It is pretty intuitive. It will help you out quite a bit. It will ask you different things so it gets to know you. Take advantage of the artificial intelligence if you would like. Don't if you don't want to. These are choices. You don't just get sucked into all of it immediately, I promise. And then there's that list of scholars again, and I can put those back in the chat after I stop sharing my screen. The second thing that a lot of our universities and institutions pay for is Office 365, Microsoft Office, what have you. The caveat on this one, Microsoft Whiteboard, is it only works on a tablet or a phone with the touch screen. I don't know about like our other laptops that are touch screen. Try it out, see how it works. I can't speak to it because I have a Mac that's not a touch screen, so I'm probably behind on this in that regard. But also a lot of our places do pay for that already. So if you can't find it, reach out and ask. Hopefully it's there. Here's a free one. You can remove ads if you pay for it. But again, I was trying to figure out how to not ask you folks in your departments or your units to pay money for software and such. It's called another whiteboard. That's really what it's called. And very similar, you can export them when you're done. As images, PDFs. So if you're doing formulas or you're trying to do Punnett squares, even your secondary student teachers or your teachers out in the field, they can do these things in different manners and then make them available to the students later on. You can do web recordings or screen recordings while you're working in some of these as well with the features most of us have in our computers now too. So lots of options. I don't recommend any over the other. A lot of it comes back to comfort. The last one is Biteable. This is the one my grad student showed me. I was like, ooh. He's doing an internship this summer. He has to make all these educational videos in food safety. And so what this company has done is offered a lot of graphics and really, really great tutorials that are in small enough bites that I was like, oh, I could actually do this. This does take time, just to be clear. We're about a month out from the semester beginning. So if you don't have the bandwidth, just because you're prepping every class for online, you've never had to do this before, this may not be the best option because it does take more time. So that's my caveat on that. When it's done, they are beautiful, but they do take time. But again, they're for you. They have educational licenses. They also remain as free versions as well. Again, options. There's so many more than that. So if there's a bunch in the chat right now, awesome, super excited. And then the training that I went through a few years ago was called Stir Fry Seminars. The gentleman is Asian, but he did a great job when he came to campus. He spent 2 days with the group walking us through all the different kinds of conflict management and resolution. You can visit his website or just Google him Stir Fry Seminars. And there's a lot of freebies, free printouts and PDFs and things like that. So if you're interested in more of that or you have someone in your life who is, then those are certainly options as well. All right. I think that's it for me, Donna.
Hold on. All righty. Switching back and forth.
Yeah, not always efficient.
Nope. Nope. So looking at the list that you had in your chat, Okay, Tiffany, am I showing my
Yep.
PowerPoint? Oh, thank goodness. Okay, looking at the list of what you had in chat, really cool stuff. And one thing I want to really emphasize is that in a lot of these classes, if you're going to start talking about identities, a challenge is that our secondary school systems, if you think about what students have learned in history, really what we're talking about with indigenous communities and African American and Black access to land, these topics are not part of what students bring with them as their previous knowledge. So I find I have to do some short snippets of history just to help give everyone a baseline of understanding, because identities are socially you know, it's a socially constructed item. Our history in our society is what then drives identities. We have to do something to help all students understand the parts of history they may not have learned in high school. So you have to decide a little bit how much you can do in your class. You may just do as a flipped session where they have to read or watch some videos ahead of time to catch them up a bit on some of the background you would like them to have that they may or may not have experienced already. So I'll just put that out there. Now, looking at your list, a couple of things. Several people teach around ag issues. And what I would encourage you to think about with ag issues, whether some people call it different things, but I'm just lumping that together. I apologize. But look at the farm worker union. That's a good place to start. The Farm Worker Union website does a lot of current updates, their press releases and topics, so that's a really great place to start knowing what's going on with our migrant workers or undocumented workers. That can be helpful. I think one of the other things I would look for to add into a current events ag issues type topic is reparations, which I can never say correctly, but like Asheville, North Carolina has already passed some legislation to not really pay back Black families, but they're really trying to redistribute their city budget to support programs and policies for their Black residents. So, and now there's also conversations going on around reparations for indigenous communities, and that's going to be interesting to see where that moves. It has come up in the past, and it's very slow or becomes a non-issue very quickly. So I'm not sure where we're going to be with moving that forward, but that's something right now that I would, if I were teaching an current ag issues class, that would be a piece of it. I think Tiffany's conversation, what she just shared about difficult conversations is important for ag issues as we try to bring people together. I think just those communication practices and trying to break down barriers with different identities who are trying to be part of the conversation would be helpful. Someone in here, I just saw it a little while ago, someone mentioned mediation training Kim mentioned she had mediation training that she found very helpful for her civil discourse unit. I agree, and I think that goes along with what Tiffany was just talking about with difficult conversations. There's somebody, high school at horticulture. Let's go back to really looking at workers' rights and worker unions and the policies there. I think that's where you're going to need to spend a little more time doing a little bit more history so students understand who we're talking about as our migrant labor or undocumented labor. And I think some time spent on understanding that not all undocumented individuals or migrant labor worker individuals are Mexican. That everything, people tend to lump groups together, but I think it's worthy to look at all the numerous countries in Central America and take a little time helping them understand the different countries that are there and where people may be traveling from and why they may choose then to be a part of our industry here. And then, another thing, but is trying to keep track of my notes here. Methods of teaching. I think we, of secondary education, we talked about some things last week. I'd be very happy to have more of a conversation with folks about teaching methods and being inclusive in your classroom. Take that a little farther, but that was a bit of what we talked about there. The cultural competency certificate, Jack's working on that. And I think that, again, the foundation piece would be helping our students know more of the history and the stories, not because our history in secondary education has really been the white story and we are eliminating all these other stories. So to bring those stories to our conversations is really important for that. And Caitlin has a great suggestion there at the bottom of chat. I'm not going to try to read it all, but great point. Hannah, several people have mentioned the manners webinars that have been going on, and they are recorded and are available through the national headquarters, and last night's was excellent. So those could be things you could use as another item on the list of resources to learn from, but also I think they're really accessible as students. They're really fun to listen to and really can appreciate hearing the voices and what folks have to say. So I think those could easily be used as assignments in some of your classes. The principles of philosophy of career and technical education. Yeah, I think that's really where the history of the Morrill Act needs to come into play. Also, I think there could be some time spent on what is identity and it's socially constructed. I think a little bit of time spent on that as part of the philosophy of career and tech ed would be very important. And some of the other foundational pieces we've already talked about. Let me just check for sure. STEM education and agriculture. I realized I really should just add a slide at the end before we make this a public slide set. And STEM education and agriculture, there's actually a couple of webinars on inclusivity in STEM education that I will add them to this and share that with you. Does anyone want to ask us questions particularly before we just finish up a couple things? Very quiet. I would say then I'd like to just speak to our survey that we're having, and Carla, if Carla could put that in the chat, that would be awesome. But we've added a couple things, particularly Dr. Vincent, we mentioned last week, is working on ideas to develop a professional development program to help bring together folks who want to teach a whole course, whether it's in cultural competency or multiculturalism or identity inclusion, however you're writing it up. But that's something. So we have 5 questions in the survey this week that would also help him think about what people are interested in terms of that potential for the future. The other thing we did is we think just based on today and looking at the different things we're trying to teach and what we're trying to get our heads around, there's opportunities for some more focused discussions. So in the survey, we also have an opportunity for you to mark if you're interested. We didn't ask for your name, which was a goof, but to have some focused topics. So what I think we'll do is try to put out on the listserv in general some topics. If we can see, if you want to mention and mark which topics are most interesting to you, I put a few in there that I would love to be in a conversation about, and that's this whole what do we want to teach to update our teaching the history of ag education, and also what do we want to be incorporating in more detail in our intro to all things ag extension and community education. But there's about 5 different topics in there with a space to add others. And we have a really great group of people. Some of you have asked to be a part of the group that got together by a hangout over the AAAE conference. And I will be adding you to that. Sorry, I haven't had time. But there's like 25 people in that group that I think we can call upon to help be a part of these conversations. Tiffany and I do not want to be part of like leading all these conversations. That's really not inclusivity. And so we hope that maybe as we identify some topics in the survey, then take that to the group, the hangout group, then we can find some folks that want to kind of collaborate on that. So that's where we're going with those, try to keep this conversation going. And Jason's got a really great point in there under chat, so you should check that out. Oh, cool. Caitlin have received a grant. If you're really reading through reading through the chats, that is phenomenal. Oh yeah, Tiffany, that's great. You can add your name to one of the text boxes if you'd like to self-identify. So if you'd like to do that in the survey. So this really still feels like the starting point for the conversations, and we see that we need to have more people involved. So that's what we're hoping can happen as we move forward. Anyone have any questions or comments or ideas you want to bring to the group? Because we're not the only people with ideas here. Thanks, Donna. Donna Graham. Everyone's so quiet. That's great. Or not great. So, Carla, did you have anything else? Oh, Hannah, hi.
Since we're fishing for things now, and Tiffany had the Seeing White podcast on her list. There's a couple episodes that are really great because I grew up in Minnesota in the whole colorblind era. And so there's a great episode that's kind of looking at racism in northern communities that really think that it's all in the South, and kind of unpacking that. And I think for those of you who are in areas that are not in the South, it's just a really powerful one to kind of unpack your own thinking, but then also it might be really helpful for your students if you are from a community that's predominantly white. There's a lot to unpack about why it's predominantly white as well. So I think just to call out that one, and I'll look up what the name of that episode is and put it in the chat. But I just re-listened to that whole series again this weekend, which I think everyone should just listen to it every year because there's so much in there. But just to call that one out.
Any other comments or things to contribute? All right, participate in the survey. So maybe we can, different groups have interests, we can keep moving forward. And really appreciate you all sitting with us and listening to us every Wednesday afternoon for the last 3 weeks. This has been great and really exciting for us because, again, Tiffany and I literally spend a lot of time in each other's offices talking about this when we used to be able to do office stuff. So it's great to have other people to talk to.
Thank you both, Donna and Tiffany, for helping lead us through these conversations on inclusion. And so as we sign off today, please feel free to stick around however long you want to. If you have other questions for our panelists, feel free to continue asking them. We'll stay on here for a couple more minutes. But thank you all so much for being here. All of the recordings will be archived and sent out, so you can come back to them at your leisure. But thank you all for joining us for these past few weeks.